Dr. Michael Dennis is a geodesist with NOAA's National Geodetic Survey, and he is, very kindly donating his time to us this afternoon to talk to us about Brave New Coordinates, the next generation of state plane in the United States. I'm going to share the screen with you, Dr. Dennis. You can take it over and show your presentation when you're ready.
Thank you everyone for joining today, and for Blue Marble for inviting me to talk about the State Plane Coordinate System of 2022, which I'm calling Brave New Coordinates, the next generation of state plane in the United States, realizing of course that some of the audience might be from other places in the world than just the US. So moving on with this, State Plane Coordinate System of 2022 is part of what we're calling modernizing the National Spatial Reference System, that is the US NSRS. It's actually the third generation of state plane. The first was in the 1930s, State Plane 27, and the second in 1980s, State Plane Coordinate System of 1983. So it's the same in a lot of ways, same three conformal map projection types: Lambert conformal conic, transverse Mercator, and Hotine oblique Mercator. And same ellipsoid as we use for State Plane 83, the GRS 80 ellipsoid. So it's the same in a lot of ways, existing state plane, but it's different too. One thing, it's based on the new terrestrial reference frames that we are creating right now instead of the North American Datum of 1983. There are more zones, most of them designed by state stakeholders rather than by NGS itself. So let's take a look at that real quick. Here's a map of the entire extent of the National Spatial Reference System. You see that it's not just United States, not just North America, United States and Alaska. It's also various islands in the Pacific and a couple islands in the Caribbean. There's also going to be layers, 3 different layers of zones. Layer 1 is statewide zones, and every state's going to have a statewide zone, but the 12 states and 6 territories will only have a statewide zone. For example, North Carolina, and you can see those are the ones shown in yellow on the map. Most states, 28, will have 2 layers, that is a statewide zone and a multiple zone layer. Then a smaller number of states, 10 of them, will have actually 3 layers. Again, a statewide zone, a multiple layer zone that covers the entire state, plus a multiple layer zone that covers parts of the state. And the logic behind that was, why we allowed it anyway, was a lot of states in mountainous areas wanted to have little zones covering specific areas to reduce map projection distortion, which I'll talk about. So we allowed that, though people did different things that we expected, because you can see Florida has 3 layers, but it's clearly not a mountainous state, so people are doing different things. And now let's look at the number of zones per state. It varies a lot. So the darker the state is on this slide, the more zones it has. It ranges from 1 for ones that only have statewide zones, like North Carolina, to as much as, well, I hate to even say it, 91 zones for Utah. That's the maximum. They have 3 layers, and they have a total of 91 zones planned for State Plane 2022. Of all these zones on here, 165 are designed by NGS. That includes the 54 statewide zones I mentioned. And there's 54 because it includes territories as well. Plus 3 so-called special use zones, which I'll get to. Those are zones in more than 1 state. They're shown on here as Gulf of Mexico, Navajo Nation, and the Kansas City zone. But most 802 zones on this map are in 28 states designed by stakeholders. So the total, as it stands in this presentation, is 967 zones for 56 states and US territories. Now you can compare that to 125 zones for existing state plane. It is a lot more zones. And one thing I really want to emphasize right now is that this is preliminary. These things will change. I'll show you a few things we go through that they're already in the process of changing that are different from what's in this presentation. But I want to emphasize, and I'll do it again and again in the presentation, that it's all preliminary right now. So the other probably the biggest change for State Plane 2022 is that the zones are designed to reduce what's called linear distortion at the topographic surface. That is to minimize the difference between so-called grid and ground distances. A cartoon might help with this. Now this cartoon shows the Earth ellipsoid, which is supposed to be right here, and the topographic surface of the Earth, and what's typically called a secant projection surface that cuts through the ellipsoid. So if you imagine that there's a light bulb down inside the Earth and it's shining through this plane, it's representing this distance on the ground, which I'm showing is parallel to the ground, as this shorter distance on the projection surface. And this is typically what you see for, say, state plane. The so-called grid distances are almost always shorter than the ground distances. That's true for state plane and even more so for universal transverse Mercator at UTM. So again, this is how state plane was designed for 1983 system and the 1927 system. But we're going to do something different this time around. Instead of having the projection surface cut through the ellipsoid itself, we're going to, or have made the projection surface coincide more with topography so that the difference between grid and ground is very small. And in this cartoon, you can see that I put a little yellow dot everywhere where the projection surface intersects the topography. At those locations, there is no distortion. Grid and ground are the same. And when you go away from those points, the difference is still pretty small. So that's the idea. You can't achieve it totally with really big zones, but for the small zones, this works quite well to essentially eliminate linear distortion. We got to talk about linear distortion some because it might be a new term for folks here. Linear distortion, we minimize that topographic surface, not the ellipsoid surface, right? And the purpose, as I said, is to reduce the difference between grid and actual ground distances. That's of great interest for surveying and engineering applications in particular. Also, NGS takes into account population distribution when we design it. So in other words, reducing distortion where there's more population. But what is linear distortion? Well, there's a mathematical way I could define it, a rigorous way, but a simpler, more common sense way is what I'm showing here with this little equation. It's the projected minus the actual distance divided by the actual distance. If you're familiar with map projection scale error, all this is map projection scale error at the topographic surface itself. It's unique, that is the same in every direction, only for conformal map projections, which is the kind we use for state plane. So in fact, it's the only conformal projections, only ones that make sense for minimizing linear distortion, because otherwise you can't get a unique value at a point. When I talk about it, I'll be talking about it in parts per million, or ppm, which is millimeters of distortion per kilometer. So what that means is, well, I'll get to it in a minute. Let's look at some more slides. Here's a little table. Talk about linear distortion magnitudes. I've got, in these 4 columns, all are saying the same thing in a different way. And over on the right here are examples. Let's look at this third one down, 100 parts per million. That's the same as 10 centimeters per kilometer, or about half a foot per mile, or 1 part in 10,000. That's what historically has been used as the design criterion for existing state plane with respect to the ellipsoid. So it means that the objective was to get the ellipsoidal distances and the projected distances to agree within 100 parts per million, or 1 part in 10,000. This one below it is 400 parts per million, or 1 part in 2,500. That's the design criterion for UTM with respect to the ellipsoid. The one at the very top is 20 parts per million. That's only 1/10 of a foot per mile, or 1 part in 50,000. That's a typical cutoff for what people often call low distortion projections. And there actually are a lot of zones in State Plane 2022 that achieve that criterion. 50 parts per million is the one I want to emphasize, because I'm going to show you some maps and whatnot about this. That is about 1/4 of a foot per mile, 1 part in 20,000. That's the lowest NGS goes in the designs we do. If states want less distortion than that in general, they have to design the zones themselves. It always helps to have maps in this situation. So here's a map of all the statewide zones for State Plane 2022 as they exist right now in their designs. And the colors indicate distortion. Right? They indicate that's grid versus ground distance. On this map, blue means that the grid distance is shorter than the ground distance. Red means the grid distance is longer than the ground distance, that is the map projected distance. And green means they're the same to within some tolerance. In this case, plus or minus 50 parts per million of a quarter or 1/4 foot per mile. Again, this is all the zones in the lower 48 all at once in the conterminous United States. So let's get some performance numbers up here. We're calling a performance of 370 parts per per million, plus or minus. What does that mean? It means that it meets these criteria: 90% of the population, 91% of the cities and towns, and 86% of the total area for the United States, for the coterminous United States, is within plus or minus 370 parts per million. Another metric is the mean distortion weighted by population, which in this case is negative 99 parts per million. We'll come back to these numbers in a minute, so you get a little more accustomed to them. First, I want to show you some of the other layers. That was the statewide zone layer. This is the multiple zone complete coverage layer, and you see it doesn't exist in all states. For example, here's North Carolina, which I pointed out before, only has a statewide zone. It doesn't have a multiple zone layer, but a bunch of states do. And there's a lot more green on this map, right? So much lower distortion. In fact, some of these states, the distortion is so low that they look entirely green. Nowhere does it come even close to 50 parts per million. In addition, some states have partial coverage. For example, Montana up here. Not the entire state is covered, so it's on a partial coverage layer. And that's also true in states that have 3 layers, like Arizona and Utah. Now, an important thing I want to say about this map, and these maps in general, is things are changing. These 2 Nevada zones here, one for Las Vegas, one for Reno, they are being removed. They're going away at the request of the state. They want to do something different for later. So they're being removed. So that's a change that's happening. Another one are these special use zones, which don't belong to any particular state, so they get their own layer, so to speak, sort of a 4th layer. And these are zones that are in more than one state. Example, actually this one exists in State Plan 83, one in the Gulf of Mexico. It's called the Louisiana Offshore Zone now, and it'll still exist. And it's either in no state or more than one state, depending how you look at it. And the Navajo Nation is in 3 different states, and Kansas City zone's in 2 states. And these 2 states agreed, Kansas and Missouri agreed on that sharing that zone. Again, I want to emphasize that things are changing. This zone will change. The distortion is going to be different, and there more zones may be added to the Gulf of Mexico. We're trying to figure that out right now. Now, if I took all the State Plan 2022 zones and put them onto one map, such that the lowest distortion layer is on top, you get a map that looks like this. So in some states like North Carolina, it's just the statewide zone. In other states like Texas, most of the states covered by a partial coverage layer, though there's a little bit here that's a complete coverage, multiple zone layer. But the whole point is, this map shows the best performance typically that you would achieve with the state plane system, distortion performance. So how does it perform? 45 plus or minus 45 parts per million. In this case, that's 90% of the population, 87% of cities and towns, and 69% of the total area. And the weighted mean distortion by population is negative 4 parts per million. That's almost 0, right? So it's very little distortion. Maybe the best way to think about this is to compare it to existing state planes. So I'm going to show you that right now. So you're all looking at the map. It's all going to change when I change the slide. You see, what is it, plus or minus 45 parts per million and a mean of negative 4. That changes to 159 parts per million and a weighted mean of negative 75 parts per million for existing state plane. And note an existing state plane, apart from the Gulf of Mexico, a lot of states, especially out west with a lot of blue, that means the grid distances are much shorter than the ground distances, typical for existing state plane. And just so you can see it again, here's that map. This is what state plane is like now. This is what state plane in the future is going to look like in terms of number of zones and distortion performance. So a lot of work went into the state plane by NGS, but by the stakeholders themselves, and they want it done. They're tired of waiting around for state plane to come out. So we keep getting this question. They want it now. Well, we hear you. We hear that. We know people want it now. And so what we've done to try to make it available sooner than when it actually rolls out is putting out on what we call an alpha product. That's a preliminary product. Not even pre-beta, right? So we make them available to the public in a way that they can see what it looks like in its preliminary form. So to do that, we've come up with an alpha website. And this is the URL up here on top, and there's a QR code at the bottom on this slide if you want to make use of that to get to the page. The key thing though, alpha products are not final products. They're preliminary for illustrative purposes only, not authoritative, under active development, subject to change without notice. Very important to understand that, and I'll be emphasizing that a lot. And also on here, there's a mechanism for providing feedback, and it goes to this email address, ncs.feedback@noaa.gov. So on this page, there's two things on here right now. There's going to be more alpha products added to this, but right now, really, it's one thing. It's state plane plus our NGS coordinate and transformation tool that supports state planes. So they're really kind of the same thing. At any rate, if you click on the State Plane 2022 box, it takes you to the State Plane 2022 alpha website and a bunch of different stuff on here. This is the home page. It gives the date last updated, which I thought I'd update it sooner than now. It was July of last year, but we'll be updating again soon. Links to other pages on the sidebar: zone information, distortion maps, an online interactive map or maps, an alpha NCAT, an NGS coordinate and transformation tool, additional information, which is worth reading, I think, and again, mechanism, same place for feedback. I'm going to focus on just a couple of these. The zone information page first. This is what this looks like. And so the thing on here are these interactive tables. There's one for zone definitions themselves. So as they exist right now, these again are being updated, but you can go and see the actual definitions for all of the zones as they exist now for State Plane 2022. And also example coordinates. So for you to test your own software or software that you use, you can take the coordinates on that from that table and see if you get the same ones when you run the map projection. And we're going to add more to this, more downloadable data for one thing, which is not part of this page, and additional tables like on zone performance. Some good news here is Blue Marble has already made use of this information. In fact, they contacted me and asked if they could get the contents of that table in a specific format, and they've done their own testing internally already, which is really good. And there's this other page is online interactive maps. So the maps I just showed you earlier, those and others are available as static maps on this website, but there are these interactive maps as well. And just real quickly, if you click on that link, it takes you to this so-called ArcGIS Online SPCS 2022 experience. They're interactive maps. It shows the distortion, but it's got some issues. The zone parameters are not given to full precision for all the zones, specifically in Wisconsin, because the digits go out too far. And you can't click on the map and get the distortion value, which I find really bothersome. But at any rate, if you click on either of these things here, it takes you to the maps themselves. It pops up like this. If you click anywhere outside that black box, you come to the maps, and there's the 4 layers, if you count the special use zone layer, are all available here. You can zoom in, zoom out, get the parameters, which are correct for most of them, and visually have a visual impression of the distortion. It's something you can navigate around and mess with at your leisure. Okay, going back to this alpha page, NSRS modernization. This alpha site is only for that, right? No other products go up here. It's only for NSRS modernization, the so-called new datums. The rollout's supposed to be it better be in 2025. And there's more to it than just State Plane 2022. It includes, if you haven't heard of it, deprecation of the US survey foot, these new terrestrial reference frames that will replace NAD83, a geopotential datum to replace NAVD88 and our other vertical datums, a more explicit time dependence to the coordinates themselves, and these things called reference epoch coordinates on everything, and more. So there's quite a few changes that are happening with that. Can't emphasize this too much. It's preliminary, right? It's preliminary. Do not assume that all this is going to change. So you say, that's great, but really, when will State Plane 2022 be done? It's going to be included as part of the rollout of modernization in 2025. All right. However, the designs themselves will be done sooner. We're getting feedback from stakeholders and others right now. We're in the process of doing things like updating the projection algorithms and make them more accurate for some of the projections. And as I said, Blue Marble has already made use of the preliminary designs for their own internal evaluation. And the objective is to finalize them by the middle of this year, put it on a Federal Register notice and all that, because we want to have them done and shared with the world this year. the reason we're doing that, finalizing the definitions now rather than waiting till the rollout, is so that our commercial partners like Blue Marble will be ready to go as soon as it comes out. They'll have it incorporated in their software and ready to go, because there's a lot of zones, for example, a lot of testing to be done. So that means providing the definitions that are directly usable by our commercial partners. For example, providing them in what's called well-known text format. It's a common format for defining projected coordinate reference systems. And that's actually what I did provide to Blue Marble, something like that last year for all the state plane zones, preliminary ones. So it's, of course, not just Blue Marble. There's Esri, Trimble, Hexagon, Topcon, Carlson, Autodesk. The list goes on and on. We want to have all of our commercial partners be ready to go with state plane and the rest of the modernized NSRS as efficiently and effectively as possible. And also, I wanted to put this on here. What we expect actually is that most of our commercial partners will go to either the EPSG geodetic parameter dataset or the ISO geodetic registry to get the definitions from there, rather than download them off our website or whatever. But we'll make them available in a variety of different ways, including EPSG and the ISO geodetic registry. So I went real fast, covered a lot of things here. Where can you learn more? Well, you can go to our website. That's geodesy.noaa.gov. Go there, and there's the QR code for it. And if you want to find out about the modernized NSRS, you can click in a few different places. You can click there where it says in that window at the top, or new datums button here, or the state planning coordinates here, and it'll get you to these alpha websites. And with that, I thank you for your attention. Even though I started a little late, I seem to have finished on time, so I guess I could take questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
My apologies again for misunderstanding the starting time. That's embarrassing. And you even emailed me. Oh well.
No worries. So we do have a few questions coming in. Thank you so much for that awesome presentation. I'm sure that people find it very informative. So first question that I've got is, because the State Plane Coordinate System 2022 is delayed, do you know if the depreciation of the U.S. survey foot will also be delayed?
That's a good question. It's been a point of confusion. So the U.S. survey foot was officially deprecated at the beginning January 1st, 2023. So it's already deprecated. However, and people, gosh, I didn't have a slide about that. So if you just Google U.S. survey foot, this is for the whole audience out there, you'll find information right away, including a Federal Register notice about it. It contains a lot of information. The most important thing in this context is the U.S. survey foot will continue to be used for legacy things forever. So for any zone in State Plane 83 and every zone in State Plane 27, if they will use the U.S. survey foot for State Plane 83, we will always support that going forward. So that means that right now, even though officially the U.S. survey foot is deprecated, if your state, well, say Maine uses U.S. survey feet, you guys are in Maine, you use them for State Plane 83, you will continue using them for State Plane 83 forever. But when you switch to State Plane 2022, you have to switch to U.S. survey, you switch to international feet.
Awesome. Well, thank you for that very comprehensive answer. We've also got another person wondering, will there ever be another update after 2022? Even though that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves.
Well, there's always going to be change. We do recognize, though, that the change can be difficult. So I think managing that change better will be our objective, and also trying to do the best we can so it doesn't have to be changed for the longest time period. I will say this, however, for State Plane 2022, there will be a mechanism for states to request changes to their states. I expect some states might want to add these low distortion projections or even switch to low distortion projection. We're seeing that already. So some of those will occur over time for State Plane.
Awesome, thank you. Well, I think that about wraps up the questions that we've got.
Oh.
But thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, we know that you're a busy man. We really appreciate your time today joining us, and for sharing all this information with our audience. I'm sure everyone found it all very informative, as we did.